Parles-tu français?
¿Hablas español?
Parli italiano?
If you've used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based technique teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world. With lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers, Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/acast. Spelled BABBEL.com/acast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Avoiding your unfinished home projects because you're not sure where to start? Thumbtack knows home so you don't have to. Don't know the difference between matte paint finish and satin? Or what that clunking sound from your dryer is? With Thumbtack, you don't have to be a home pro. You just have to hire one. You can hire top-rated pros, see price estimates, and read reviews all on the app. Download today.
Welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. I'm very, very honoured today to have Stewart Home here with us to talk about his book, Fascist Yoga, a kind of hidden history almost of the slightly murkier origins of the kind of the global yoga industry that we know now, and which also has a kind of contemporary resonance with the kind of the strange cultural and to some extent intellectual crossovers that we saw in recent years as far right ideas and new age ideas merged in a kind of toxic brew, particularly around the moment of the pandemic. But anyway, I will open up to Stewart. Firstly, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you today.
Nice to be here, Nick.
And let's begin just by talking about the origins of the book. How did the as a kind of like an idea, how did it come about?
It basically came about because I mainly write fiction, although I do some non-fiction books. I've done a book on punk rock a long time ago. I don't think I'd write one on that now. A book about post-war avant-garde, and a book on Bruceploitation movies, which is a martial arts subgenre, which is a particular interest of mine. So, my experience of yoga was as a child. I don't know if it was broadcast UK-wide, but I was watching Thames and London Weekend television. And there was an American guy called Richard Hiddleman on with a yoga program kind of when I came in from school. And if it was wet and you couldn't run around in the streets, so I'd sometimes watch him on the old black and white TV. So that, I was aware of him, but I was much more interested in martial arts and stuff like that, Bruce Lee and Kung Fu from 74 on, although he was probably on a little bit earlier than that. I didn't really think about yoga at all for years and years, decades, in fact. And then because I had, pressure from publishers to present my books in public, and I didn't really like conventional literary readings with someone mumbling into a page, I just first of all decided to recite my text from memory. Then I decided to do ventriloquism because a guy called Ken Campbell, who's some people will know, spotted me reading at an event and said, "You were born to be a ventriloquist." He was correct. If I practice, I am actually a very good
Hmm.
ventriloquist to blow my own horn. But no, he spotted it. It wasn't a talent I realized I had, but I have a stone face and don't move my mouth a lot when I talk because I've got a South London accent. And then I thought, well, maybe I could read standing on my head. So I was belonged to local gym in South Islington, local council gym. Uh, and I'd go and do my weightlifting and my went to boxing classes and stuff. And I noticed that after one of the boxing classes, there was a yoga class, and I asked about it, and they said, yeah, they stand on their heads in the yoga class. So I thought, oh, I'll go and learn to stand on my head. And I was just fascinated by the amount of basically bullshit that I heard as soon as I went to a yoga class.
Right.
Stuff about chakras and meridians and internal energy lines. And it struck me as like utter nonsense. And I'd always had a soft spot for that kind of thing as humor. When I was a kid, I'd, read T. Lobsang Rampa or Cyril Henry Hoggerty, to use his real name, The Third Eye, and all those kinds of books, as I found them hilarious.
Hmm.
And, when I was a little bit older, 16 or whatever, came across Aleister Crowley's novels, Diary of a Drug Fiend and Moonchild, and thought they were absolutely hilarious. Reading that kind of thing as comedy. So, I got quite fascinated by how can this level of bullshit be going on in a gym? Surely it's about exercise, but a lot of other things were being talked about. So I just kind of they had yoga classes every day, all sorts of different styles and different teachers. Uh, and I kind of ran through as many classes as I could to try and figure out what was going on and started reading up on yoga. So this was from about 2009.
Hmm.
Um, and quickly came across 2010 Mark Singleton's book Yoga Body had been published, but that's part of a broader discourse. His is probably just the best known book, suggesting that yoga arose in the 1920s, that yoga was invented by Indian nationalists who took Western exercises and then claimed that what they were taking were inferior versions of ancient Indian exercise systems, and invented modern yoga. So there's a whole lot of academic discourse around that. But when
Yeah.
I kind of started looking at the subject, came across Pierre Bernard, who was a figure who'd been revived. And he was obviously doing what you could call modern postural practice, which kind of it is to differentiate what goes on in yoga studios and gyms in the West from,
Hmm.
what was done as meditation and was quite a different thing in ancient India. Uh, he was obviously doing, it's hard to say exactly when he started because there's a lot of fabrication and lies around him, uh, a lot of which he was responsible for, but not all of which. So he was certainly doing it 10, maybe 15, maybe 20 years earlier than the Indians. Whether there was a direct transmission from him or whether, two sets of people had a similar idea is hard to tell. But Bernard's disciples were very important in spreading yoga in the early part of the 20th century. So Francis Yates Brown, who was a British fascist, who wrote The Bengal Lancer, or Lives of the Bengal Lancer. Is made into a film by Gary Cooper, who in that book claimed to have learned yoga in India, but in fact, historians like Kate Imey have by going through his archives, have shown that he learned yoga from Pierre Bernard in Nyack, New York in the 1920s. He had a lot of magazine articles about him, and Bernard's nephew, Theos Bernard, who fabricated a lot of fake autobiography around going to Tibet and things, and
Hmm.
also learned yoga. He appeared to have learned initially, although he claimed an Indian guru, he appears to have learned initially from his father and then from his uncle, Pierre Bernard. And he got a lot of newspaper publicity. And there's also a guy you may know from his kind of tales of spying against the Bolsheviks, Paul Dukes, who was
Oh,
a
yes.
student of Bernard in the 20s. So what's believed to be the first series of yoga programs were presented by him in the late 40s on the BBC. So the whole group that connects down from Bernard are quite important in the propagation of yoga in the early part of the 20th century. And this is what people in the overdeveloped world had access to much more than Indian gurus. You could, write off to India and order books written by Indian gurus on yoga, but the material from the Bernard Circle and other people, I mean, Ryder, the occult publisher, also published a lot of books on yoga in the pre-war period. And so generally what was accessible in the West was books by Occidental authors, although they did sometimes use Indian pseudonyms. So that was, I was reading through that strand of stuff. And then around 2000, it was 2016, I saw an Observer article which had a photo of a guy in a half lotus with a MAGA, Make America Great Again, cap on his knee and a Celtic cross behind him, obviously repurposed from its original meanings. It had been used by the official National Front in the UK, so one can read it as fascist. And an article expressing surprise that this guy, who was a far-right American activist, also was interested in yoga and tarot and spirituality, all this sort of stuff. Because I looked at things with other people like neo-folk, which is a subgenre of rock music, which was kind of created as a I think the people who started it they were involved with the official National Front. It's hard to tell exactly who was behind it, but some of the musicians definitely were. And they had a kind of metapolitical approach to spreading fascism, where they wanted to use culture and not admit they were fascists, so they drew people into the kind of cultural activities. I mean, they were drawing on the French Nouvelle Droite, Alain de Benoist, Guillaume Maffei, figures like that for ideological inspiration, and also Julius Evola, who appears in the Fascist Yoga book. So I was aware of these kind of fascists who were kind of not necessarily yoga practicing, but tarot card reading, spiritually inclined, involved in a fascist counterculture. So when I saw the picture of one fascist doing yoga, I immediately thought there must be more and went and looked for them, which is when I kind of went back and found Frances Yates Brown. Kate Army also went through JFC Fuller in her essay. She used the archives to show how he again faked who his gurus were, trying to make out they were Indian. Both him and Yates Brown had served in the British Army in India, but in actual fact, in Fuller's case, he learned his yoga from Aleister Crowley, the wickedest man in the world, as the press in the early part of the 20th century had it, black magician, or they presented him as a black magician. So, that was something I was familiar with Fuller anyway, because of having, as a teenager, kind of found Crowley very amusing and read up a little bit about him without actually kind of believing that kind of nonsense. So it was all those different elements coming together that kind of led to the idea of the book. And, one area of interest leads to another. So, I'd read quite a lot about fascist ideology and found historians like C. Sternhill, Birth of Fascist Ideology, very interesting, where he connects, he suggests it emerged in France in 1913, and it's a kind of convergence of monarchism and kind of anarchist Sorelian currents in France. So those were all the background things.
And there is a great, there is that kind of proto-fascist moment, there are all sorts of currents of metaphysical ideas and romantic ideas within it, not to kind of debase metaphysical or romantic thought, but fascism has always had these currents of again, I don't even want to call it spirituality, because it's a sort of the fascism is a sort of almost like an antithesis to sort of the spiritual notions of the spiritual, but it contains with it these kind of these metaphysical ideas, which are kind of diametrically opposed to the very materialist view of the world that the Marxism it claims to kind of it came to diametrically oppose in the early parts of the 20th century, obviously is grounded in. I had a very interesting experience when I was looking at the book. There's a friend of mine who went to an ashram in India, getting on for about 7 or 8 years ago, to training in yoga. And it was quite a traumatic trip. And when they got there, one of the instructors had invited a guest speaker, this American lady, white American, and the relevance of that will become clear, to talk to all the attendees about, giving them kind of like a spiritual lecture, also almost about the rationale behind the injustices of the world. And this was an idea that this person believed themselves to be grounded in sort of, I think it was kind of probably Hare Krishna thought, not to malign the Hare Krishnas at all. But she said essentially there was this racial taxonomy in the world. And, when you go out I think they were in Goa or something like that. And when you go out in the streets and you see poverty in India, don't worry too much, because those people haven't really evolved to our level. We would find it very distressing to be that poor, but they don't. They sort of don't mind it really, because they're at a lower frequency to us. And I was thinking, well, is it just that there was, particularly sort of psychopathic and unbalanced person there? Or is there a kind of, within New Age circles, it was this person quoting a particular philosophy that kind of does the rounds? And I thought, I know, when I speak to Stewart, I'll ask him. Does that chime with things that you've kind of heard in this field?
Yeah, I mean, to go back to Bernard, who didn't write a lot himself, so one relies on his endorsements of his disciples' writings to kind of understand him. There's one of his other key disciples was a guy called Hamish McLaren, and he was a journalist. So he did a book which Bernard endorsed, and Francis Yates Brown wrote the introduction for, called Eastern Philosophy for Western Minds. So he lays out the kind of theory, their theory or claims. It's not really a theory because it's completely false, of where yoga came from. So, according to the kind of Bernard circle, and McLaren explicitly, and Yates Brown repeats it in his Yoga Explained from 37 a few years later, yoga was invented by the blonde Aryan invaders of the Indus Valley 5,000 years ago. And, because the people who were already there were so backward, they were easily conquered. But you couldn't trust them with yoga and these techniques because they weren't evolved enough. So therefore, the Aryans also created the caste system, making themselves as Brahmins. So, this fits right into Nazi Aryanist racial theories as well, straight
Yeah.
away. And McLaren is very anti-Semitic as well, and says that, Christianity is a really bad moral code for Aryans because it's Semitic. And in actual fact, yoga is the true kind of Aryan way. And I think it's Yates Brown who talks about beef-eating Brahmins as though they're kind of as British as you and I. I mean, obviously, Aryan as a term was originally used for kind of linguistic and cultural reasons. I mean, racial theory is nonsense, so you can't actually differentiate scientifically the human race into races. But it chimes very much, and I think it comes out of it's particularly in the West, a very simplistic reading and a kind of homogenizing of a lot of texts and traditions from different parts of India and the Indian subcontinent. It's not all India, and it's also not all Hindu. I mean, obviously, Jains, Buddhists, and other kind of earlier religious formations feed into all that thought.
Yeah. And it's in, I mean, my various readings of Nazi Germany, the various kind of, well, many histories I've read of it, a lot of this, the sort of, I mean, if you sort of kind of watch a bit too much of the History Channel, it would have you believe that a lot of this kind of esoteric thought, it was at the heart of, Nazism and Hitler's attention, and it's not really channel sort of history channel things of like Hitler's occult scientists or whatever. That's sort of you know if those people did exist, they're really, really on the very fringes of the influence within the Nazi movement. And I know there was, I think, a couple of expeditions to India by Himmler, I think, looking for sort of evidence of an Aryan past there, but it's all kind of peripheral nonsense, really, to the true horrors of Nazism. But actually, it all of this kind of this mad sort of sea of discourses that most people have no idea about and no kind of engagement with. There's a small subculture of people that really are hugely engaged with it. And I wonder, I mean, my question is, are the people that engage with all of this kind of racist, anti-Semitic, esoteric thought?
Parles-tu français?
¿Hablas español?
Parli italiano?
If you've used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based technique teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world. With lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers, Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/acast. Spelled BABBEL.com/acast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Avoiding your unfinished home projects because you're not sure where to start? Thumbtack knows home so you don't have to. Don't know the difference between matte paint finish and satin? Or what that clunking sound from your dryer is? With Thumbtack, you don't have to be a home pro. You just have to hire one. You can hire top-rated pros, see price estimates, and read reviews all on the app. Download today.
Committed neo-Nazis, or or are you finding that they are people who are Nazi curious, or people who are kind of perhaps just interested in yoga and their minds wander into all sorts of dark places?
I think there's a spectrum of people, and there are definitely people who are trying to use that kind of material to lure in the Nazi curious. I mean, a lot of the claims about the Nazis and the occults, which it's hard to say the origin, but one of the earlier books would be Powers and Berger, The Morning Magicians, and then you have all the nonsense like The Spear of Destiny by Hugh Trevor Roper. There are some serious works on the subject, but yes, I think it's a whole, people have a whole range of positions, but in terms of people being engaged in yoga, why would they want to believe it's a 5,000-year-old tradition? When quite obviously, if you go to a yoga class in a gym, the pedagogy is modern. The way the class is held, the whole notion of the class is modern. People didn't exercise in that way a millennia ago, let alone 5,000 years ago. You'd have thought it was self-evident that what you're doing isn't an ancient practice if you know a little bit about physical culture and kind of the development of physical culture. And yet people seem very keen to believe that it's 5,000 years old. But I mean, in terms of going to, I certainly went to over 1,000 yoga classes because I quite like to be thorough and try very many different styles. I didn't encounter any instructors who I could identify as far right, but some of the students were. But I certainly heard an enormous amount of nonsense. And I think that people could shift, but I stopped going to yoga classes before the pandemic. And what I heard parallel to some of the yoga influencers getting into, QAnon and anti-vax theory prior to the pandemic was kind of anti-MMR rhetoric, which you'd hear quite a lot of, and a whole belief in alternative medicine and a kind of rejection of modern medical science, basically,
Yeah.
which obviously isn't perfect, but is the best that we've got and has saved a lot of lives in a way that, I mentioned in the book, for example, I heard a lot of absurd claims about what doing different yoga poses would do for me. I didn't hear anything quite as absurd as what you can find in kind of historical, as in 20th century yoga texts, for example, claiming that shoulder stand will cure leprosy. I mean,
Mm.
leprosy is a curable disease, but it isn't curable by shoulder stand.
No.
Um, so I think just kind of being in that whole wellness mindset and it kind of opens people up to a lot of reactionary beliefs, so
Mm.
that people did then get drawn into QAnon, for example, which basically at its heart says that Donald Trump is this supernatural being who's going to save humanity from a cabal of cannibalistic pedophiles. I mean, that has immediate resonances with the ideas of Savitri Devi and Miguel Serrano. So Devi wanted to refound National Socialism as a religion after the defeat of the Nazis. I mean, that's not her original name. Curiously, the two female characters who feature in the book both had European names and then chose to call themselves Devi as their surname, meaning goddess, I understand. But she wanted to refound National Socialism as a religion. She had a mixed British, Greek, French background, and had
Mhm.
got obsessed with Greek Aryanism, which again is nonsense, and had gone to India and worked for the Axis during the war, conveying messages to the Japanese. But she then, I think, through her kind of right-wing Hindu circles, developed this idea that Hitler was the late-born child of light, he who returned whenever he was needed. He'd previously been Akhenaten and Genghis Khan. And as Hitler was the 10th incarnation of Vishnu as Kalki. So Hitler was this supernatural being who'd come to save the Aryan race, which is quite, we don't know exactly who made the Q drops, although there are some interesting clues. So we don't know whether they would have been aware of esoteric Hitlerism, or they were just using a kind of similar far-right mythic structure and came up with a similar idea. But I don't think it's surprising that those similarities should be there, regardless of whether there was a direct transmission or not.
It shows you something interesting about things like the Overton windows and how people's perceptions change. Here where I am in Cardiff, there was an anti-lockdown protest in Cardiff Bay outside the Senate, and you had there, your proper kind of EDL, Combat 18 BMP, thugs, real nasties. And then, your yoga mums who, I mean, if you'd have asked them 2, 3 years beforehand, do you want to kind of take some time out of your kind of rather comfy suburban existence to spend time with somebody who, who stalks the local Asian shopkeeper and listens to Screwdriver, the chances are they'd probably say no. But and probably they were in crowds of people they didn't know exactly who they were with, but they were sharing certain ideas. There was, if in the Venn diagram of beliefs, there was overlap here, and I found it surprising at the time. But then, there are gateways of kind of ideas, and I think we're talking about them now. Really, there are people again who I just would, I think, even today, if you ask them, would not identify as having fascist views, but can articulate certain things that they believe to be now self-evident, which are either actually fascist racial supremacist views, or they are shared by fascists. And so there's it's a really troubling kind of arena there.
Parles-tu français?
¿Hablas español?
Parli italiano?
If you've used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based technique teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world. With lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers, Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/acast. Spelled BABBEL.com/acast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Avoiding your unfinished home projects because you're not sure where to start? Thumbtack knows home so you don't have to. Don't know the difference between matte paint finish and satin? Or what that clunking sound from your dryer is? With Thumbtack, you don't have to be a home pro. You just have to hire one. You can hire top-rated pros, see price estimates, and read reviews all on the app. Download today.
No, I mean, I see that as well because, being involved in some, local community campaigns around Islington, to save the football pitches, five-side football pitches from being built on or whatever, you meet all sorts of people, including people who would claim to be witches. And, start going on about, the fifth dimension and star seeds and all sorts of other stuff, which, you can certainly find. I mean, I've seen stuff suggesting that the seed theory can be traced back through William Dudley Pelley and the kind of silver shirts in the US and definite fascist currents. But the women into this stuff would claim to be nothing to do with fascists, but they'll also say that the left and right don't exist anymore, and kind of getting in bed with bizarre currents that I would say were definitely right wing.
Yeah.
And reading papers, is it called The Light? I think it is. They'd show you these absolutely bonkers papers which would have articles in by actual literal fascists that you could identify. I wouldn't want to take the paper away with me when they offered it.
Very nice, but thank you. But no thanks.
Yeah, not my cup of tea.
And then when you look at, I mean, the various histories of fascism, obviously that if you're to talk about fascism, people will think of Nazism as that, but Nazism is the dominant iteration of fascism in the 20th century, but it's not the only one. And fascism, there is this kind of long, complicated, and very kind of fluid intellectual history of fascism. People like Ezra Pound before the 1920s weren't thinking about the Holocaust, as far as I can gather. I mean, they had all sorts of kind of awful reactionary views. So fascism has ways of has different sort of iterations and different ways of presenting itself, but its core ideas are those of kind of anti-democratic authoritarian elite rule, which is normally has some kind of racial taxonomy within it, and it just finds now through things like Trump and QAnon and online conspiracy theories and stuff like that, new ways of kind of emerging and reinventing itself.
Yeah, no, I mean, you see all sorts of things. I mean, obviously, narcissism as a kind of dominant strain, it wouldn't be appealing, because of its emphasis on Aryanism within the racial ideology, which is the kind of one of the key elements of Nazi ideology. That obviously wouldn't appeal to Latino fascists because they're not Aryan and they're not configured as Aryan.
Yeah.
And also Nazism, certainly wasn't the only form of fascism in Germany in the 1920s. I mean, it's surprising because there were other strands like, say, National Bolshevism, which I parodied in an early novel of mine, a novel called Blowjob. And I knew nothing about Russian National Bolshevism at the time I wrote the parody. I'd come across some former official National Front members who saw themselves as fascist intellectuals, and they seemed to not literally face to face, but in terms of reading up about stuff, they seemed to think it was a good idea to kind of configure themselves as national Bolsheviks, which no one much had a clue what they were on about.
Mhm.
Ernst Jünger, the author of Storms of Steel, being the kind of one very visible national Bolshevik from the 1920s in Germany. But then obviously with figures like Alexander Dugin and Limonov,
Mhm.
you had the National Bolshevik movement in Russia. So my book was translated into Russian, and my books were quite successful in my novels, quite successful in Russia. And the National Bolsheviks were absolutely infuriated by my parody of National Bolshevism within the book, but I wasn't even aware of Russian National Bolshevism at the time it was written. But there are those. I mean, obviously, it makes sense that National Bolshevism would be revived in Russia, but
Nothing.
it's
There's nothing worse than a fascist with no sense of humor, is there? Eh? You know.
no, no. Some of them sadly do have a sense of humor. I write in the book about meeting this friend of my mother being Welsh, as you're in Cardiff, and also the friend having a Welsh background, Bill Hopkins, and I went to talk to him because I wanted to talk to him about my mother's life. She died in 79. So, I didn't know much about him. I understood he was an antique dealer, successful antique dealer in the Portobello Road. Very nice guy. Asked me what I like to drink, and I think I said Talisker whiskey. He didn't have any. He went out and bought a bottle because I got around to his house. But as the evening wore on, I realised that he was a fascist when he started talking about Hitler as the most important man of the 20th century and various other things. But he did have a sense of humour, and he was actually, on a personal level, a very generous guy, and had an absolutely horrendous ideology. And then later, I read in Searchlight that the ongoing court cases that were only concluded very recently around the Bologna train station bombing and things like that, that his name was coming up in the court cases because there was a kind of cartel of far-right antique
Mhm.
dealers who were used to move money around the place, and he was an antique dealer. So, it's you have to understand that you can meet someone and they can seem like a nice person, although I think that's rather different when you were talking about the anti-lockdown demonstrations, and you had people unfurling kind of British Union of Fascist flags in Trafalgar Square. You'd
Mhm.
hope that people could recognise that what that was when it kind of got unfurled in front of them. But
Yeah.
yeah, the idea that fascists don't have a sense of humour, I mean, is not true in my experience of having met a few.
We must finish there. We're nearly out of time. But
Okay.
before we finish, let's just talk about the book. Available currently in all good bookshops.
Most good bookshops and available from the publisher, plus the
Okay.
usual online platforms.
This is an important point, folks. We make this each and every time. Please buy it from a local independent bookshop. I'll put a link to the publisher below. Support your grassroots publishers and booksellers because you'll miss them when they're gone.
No, you will. And Pluto is an independent publisher, so as well, not corporate.
Excellent. Well, Stuart, it was an amazing chat today. Really, really, very grateful to have you on. And please do, if you have want to come back and chat in the future about, you know, fascists, Crowley, the esoteric and the mundane. It'd be a pleasure
Yes.
to chat again.
No, there's a lot of stuff. Where are you from? You don't sound, you haven't got a
I've,
strong north.
I am one of life's tumbleweeds. No, I'm from the northwest originally, and I crash landed in Cardiff under
Well,
dubious.
it's a good place to be. My
Yeah,
mum grew up in Newport, so not so, and used to go down to Tiger Bay for the beatnik jazz, modern jazz in the 50s before she moved to London.
and we're Shirley
So
Bassey.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. A lot of great history in Wales.
Yeah. Super. Well, Stuart, I'll leave you there and take good care. And it was so lovely to chat with you today. And
Yeah.
all the best with the book.
Thanks a lot, Nick.
Cheers.
Take care.
Parles-tu français?
¿Hablas español?
Parli italiano?
If you've used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based technique teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world. With lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers, Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/acast. Spelled BABBEL.com/acast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
El rugido de los aficionados, el ritmo de las porras, la intensidad en la cancha. Esto es más que solo un partido de fútbol. Con DraftKings Sportsbook, esta es tu oportunidad de convertir cada jugada en una gran ganancia. Descarga la app de DraftKings Sportsbook y usa el código HEART. Ese es el código HEART para que los nuevos usuarios reciban $200 en bonus bets al instante cuando apuestes solo $5. En asociación con DraftKings, la corona es tuya. ¿Problemas con el juego? Llama al 1-800-GAMBLER. En Nueva York, llama al 877-8-HOPE-NY o envía un mensaje de texto con la palabra HOPE-NY al 467-369. En Connecticut, hay ayuda disponible para problemas con el juego. Llama al 888-789-7777 o visita ccpg.org. Juega responsablemente. En nombre de Boot Hill Casino and Resort, Kansas. Debe ser mayor de 21 años. La elegibilidad varía según la jurisdicción. No válido en Ontario. Pueden aplicarse cargos en Illinois. Las apuestas de bonos son de un solo uso. La apuesta no se incluye en las ganancias y caducan después de ser otorgadas. La oferta finaliza el 29 de septiembre 2025 a las 11:59 p.m. hora del este. Los términos en DraftKings.com/sportsbook/promos.